This is what happens when people like you move in, Carol Whitaker whispered as the black spray paint hissed across the side of her neighbor's sedan. The sound was small, almost delicate, like air escaping from a tire, but in the quiet of Oak Ridge Lane at 10:47 p.m., it seemed loud enough to wake every house on the block. Carol stood beneath a streetlight with one gloved hand wrapped around the can and the other clutching the sleeve of her beige cardigan against the October cold. The neighborhood behind her looked perfect in the way expensive neighborhoods try to look innocent at night: trimmed hedges, porch lanterns glowing amber, sprinklers ticking softly over dark lawns, American flags folded still beside white columns. In the driveway across from her, Judge Marcus Ellison's black sedan reflected the moon in its polished door panels until the paint cut through that reflection in a jagged line of ugly letters. Carol did not know he was a judge. To her, he was only the black man who had bought the brick colonial at the corner 3 months earlier, the quiet one with the tailored suits, the calm greetings, and the habit of making her feel ignored whenever she tried to remind him what kind of street Oak Ridge Lane was supposed to be. She had told herself she was not doing anything terrible. Just sending a message. Just defending property values. Just making visible what everyone else was too polite to say. But excuses sound different in the dark when your own hand is the one making the damage. A porch light flickered on at the Miller house next door. Carol froze. The spray stopped midline, leaving the final letter wet and unfinished. Across the street, 16-year-old Evan Miller stood behind the glass of his upstairs bedroom window, his gaming headset still around his neck, his phone raised in disbelief. A small blue glow from the screen lit his face as he stared down at her. Carol's mouth opened, but nothing came out. She glanced toward Marcus's house. The windows were dark except for one soft light near the study, where a thin curtain moved slightly behind the glass. For one breath, Oak Ridge Lane held completely still. Then Evan pushed his window open. "Mrs. Whitaker?" he called, his voice cracking with shock. "What are you doing?" Carol turned quickly, the can slipping lower beside her skirt. The smell of fresh paint rose sharp and chemical in the cold air. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and fell silent. "Go back inside, Evan," she said, trying to sound like the adult in charge, but her voice had lost its polish. "This does not concern you." The boy did not move. His phone stayed pointed toward her. "That is Mr. Ellison's car." Carol looked at the wet words on the door, then at the camera above the Miller porch, its tiny red light blinking steadily. She had thought the darkness was covering her. She had forgotten that truth sometimes watches quietly before it speaks. Marcus Ellison had chosen Oak Ridge Lane because it was quiet enough to hear himself think. At 48, he had spent too many years inside rooms where every word carried weight, where people stood when he entered, where silence was not emptiness but responsibility. The brick colonial at the corner had a small study facing the street, a maple tree in the front yard, and a porch wide enough for one chair and one cup of coffee before sunrise. That was all he wanted. He did not move there to impress anyone. He did not host loud parties, did not park carelessly, did not challenge the rules of the neighborhood. He kept the lawn trimmed, brought his trash bins back before noon, waved to joggers, and once spent 20 minutes helping Mrs. Bennett from 3 houses down carry grocery bags when her hip was bothering her. To most people on the block, he was simply Mr. Ellison, the quiet black man in the tailored suits who left early and came home late, the one who drove a black sedan and read thick files behind drawn curtains. He never corrected them. His work did not need applause. In the federal courthouse downtown, his full name carried a different gravity: the Honorable Marcus Ellison, United States District Judge. But at home, he preferred the ordinary rituals that made power feel human again. On Saturdays he watered his roses in an old Howard University sweatshirt. On Sundays he called his sister in Baltimore and listened to his nieces argue in the background about pancakes. In the evenings, he sat in his study with a ceramic mug of tea and reviewed opinions beneath the warm yellow lamp his late wife had bought him before she passed. Her photograph still stood on the shelf beside his law books, smiling in a blue dress at a charity dinner, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Some nights he spoke to that picture more honestly than he spoke to anyone else. He had known prejudice long before Oakridge Lane gave it polished hedges and homeowners' committee language. He had known it as a young clerk mistaken for a delivery man in the courthouse where he worked. He had known it as a prosecutor asked whether he was lost outside the judge's chambers. He had known it in soft phrases, tight smiles, extra questions, and rooms where people were surprised not by his anger, but by his excellence. So when Carol Whitaker began appearing at his mailbox with comments about community standards, noise concerns that did not exist, and property values spoken like a warning, Marcus recognized the shape of it. He did not feed it. He answered politely, documented quietly, and continued living. That night, when Evan's voice cracked through the cold air outside, Marcus was in his study reading a sealed motion, his glasses low on his nose, the house wrapped in stillness. At first, he thought the sound belonged to some ordinary teenage argument. Then he heard his name. He stood slowly, moved to the window, and looked through the curtain. The streetlight showed Carol beside his sedan, pale and rigid, one hand low at her side. Evan was at his upstairs window, phone raised. The smell reached him only after he opened the front door, fresh spray paint, sharp as an accusation. Marcus stepped onto the porch in his dress shirt and dark slacks, not rushing, not shouting, his face settling into the calm that had unnerved guilty people in courtrooms for years. He looked at the wet words on his car. Then he looked at Carol. She looked away first. Carol Whitaker had lived on Oakridge Lane long enough to mistake familiarity for ownership. For 23 years, she had watched families move in and out of the brick houses beneath the maples, bringing new curtains, new lawn furniture, new holiday decorations, and sometimes new ideas she did not invite. She called herself protective. The neighbors called her organized when they were being polite, difficult when she was not in the room. Carol preferred words that sounded cleaner: standards, safety, preservation, tradition. They made her feel reasonable when she complained about teenagers walking too slowly past mailboxes, delivery drivers parking near her curb, or renters who did not trim hedges to the exact height she thought respectful. Her husband, Richard, had died 6 years earlier, leaving her the white colonial with the slate roof, a comfortable retirement account, and a loneliness she filled with committee emails and whispered judgments. She never became president of a real homeowners association because Oakridge Lane did not have one, so she created the next closest thing, a neighborhood watch group that met over coffee in her sunroom and used the word concern more often than truth. When Marcus Ellison bought the corner house, Carol noticed before the moving truck finished backing into the driveway. She stood behind her lace curtains with her phone in one hand and a mug of chamomile tea in the other, watching two movers carry in bookshelves, framed art, and boxes labeled study. The house had sold above asking price, which should have pleased her, but it did not. Something about Marcus bothered her from the beginning, though she would never have said it plainly. She said he was private. She said he was hard to read. She said people should introduce themselves properly when entering an established community. What she meant was that he had arrived without asking to be accepted, and that unsettled her more than any loud party could have. Over the next 3 months, she collected small grievances the way some people collect receipts. His porch light stayed on too late. His car looked too official. His visitors came in dark suits. He did not attend her coffee meetings. He smiled politely but never explained where he worked. Each ordinary detail became suspicious once Carol decided it belonged to a suspicious man. Earlier that afternoon, she had seen him in his driveway speaking with a woman in a dark government vehicle. They had exchanged a folder, nodded once, and gone their separate ways. To anyone else, it would have looked like business. To Carol, it looked like secrecy. By evening, she had written 3 versions of a neighborhood message and deleted all of them because none sounded innocent enough. Then she found a can of black spray paint in the garage, left over from marking old patio furniture. The idea arrived quietly, then dressed itself as justice. She told herself she would only write a warning, something small, something that would make him understand he was being watched. But when Marcus opened his front door and stepped onto the porch, calm beneath the streetlight, Carol felt the story slipping away from her. His silence did not look guilty. It looked measured. It looked like a man already gathering facts. And for the first time that night, Carol understood that being caught was not the worst part. The worst part was realizing he did not look surprised. Marcus did not step off the porch right away. He stood beneath the warm light above his front door, shoulders square, sleeves rolled once at the wrists, his gaze moving from Carol's gloved hand to the wet black letters on the sedan door, then to Evan Miller's phone still raised at the upstairs window across the street. The quiet was doing what quiet often did around guilty people. It gave them too much room to hear themselves. Carol tightened her grip around the spray can as if hiding it beside her skirt could erase the smell in the air. "Marcus," she said, forcing his first name into a tone of neighborly alarm. "You startled me." He looked at her for a long second. "I startled you in my driveway?" The question was soft, but it carried across the street with courtroom clarity. Evan's phone did not move. A porch light clicked on 2 houses down. Then another. Curtains parted in careful little gaps. Oakridge Lane began waking up, not with concern, but with curiosity. Carol felt the eyes before she saw the faces, and instinct took over faster than shame. She lifted her free hand toward her chest and turned slightly toward the watching houses. "I came over because I heard something," she said quickly. "I thought someone was outside your house. Then you came out so suddenly, and I felt threatened." The lie entered the night fully dressed, polished and trembling. Marcus did not interrupt it. He had seen this kind of reversal before, in affidavits, hearings, police statements, workplace complaints, and neighborhood meetings where the person who caused harm discovered that fear was easier to sell than truth. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, "please place the can on the ground and wait for the police." Her eyes widened, not because he had raised his voice, but because he had not. "The police?" "Yes." "You are calling the police on me?" The word "me" carried all the disbelief of a woman who had spent a lifetime assuming consequences belonged to other people. Marcus reached into his pocket and took out his phone. "There is property damage. There is a witness. There appears to be video." Evan leaned farther out his window. "My doorbell camera got it too, Mr. Ellison," he called. "I saw her from the start." Carol turned toward him sharply. "Evan, you do not understand what you saw." "I understand spray paint," Evan said, his voice steadier now. "And I understand recording." Across the street, Mrs. Bennett stepped onto her porch in a robe, one hand resting on her cane, eyes fixed on the black paint drying under the streetlight. A man in running shorts paused at the end of the block with his dog. The neighborhood Carol had tried to command was now assembled around her, and she could feel control leaking away with every second. She placed the spray can on the curb, but only after wiping her gloved fingers against her cardigan in a nervous, useless gesture. Marcus noticed. Evan's camera noticed. The blinking red light above the Miller porch noticed. Carol took one step back and lifted her chin, searching for the version of herself the neighbors were used to seeing. "He has been making people uncomfortable since he moved in," she said louder now, aiming at the porches. "Someone had to say something." Marcus's face changed by almost nothing, but something in his eyes settled colder than anger. "And this is how you chose to say it?" The siren did not sound at first. Only the low approach of tires on asphalt, then the sweep of headlights turning onto Oakridge Lane. Carol looked relieved for half a second, as if the arrival of a uniform might restore the world she understood. Marcus looked at the painted door of his car, then at Evan's raised phone, then at the neighbors, pretending their silence had not helped build this moment. When the patrol car stopped at the curb, Carol stepped toward it before anyone else could speak, already shaping her voice into fear. Marcus stayed beside his porch steps, calm and still, letting the evidence breathe. Officer Daniel Price stepped out of the patrol car with the tired caution of a man who had answered too many neighborhood calls that began with property lines and ended with people revealing more about themselves than they intended. He was local, mid-40s, rain jacket over his uniform, flashlight angled toward the pavement instead of anyone's face. Carol reached him first, moving quickly across the curb as if speed could make her story arrive before the evidence. "Officer, thank goodness," she said, her voice shaking at just the right edges. "I was checking on a disturbance, and he came outside acting aggressive. I did not know what he was going to do." Marcus remained near his porch steps, his hands visible, his posture quiet, his sedan behind him marked by wet black paint that glistened under the streetlight. Officer Price looked from Carol to Marcus, then to the spray can resting near the curb, then to Evans still recording from his upstairs window. "Who owns the vehicle?" Price asked. "I do," Marcus said. His voice was low, steady, almost gentle. Carol turned toward the officer, lowering her tone. "He has made several of us uncomfortable since he moved here. He watches people. He keeps strange hours. I was afraid." The word afraid moved across the lawn and found familiar places to settle. A few neighbors shifted on their porches. Someone whispered behind a screen door. Marcus felt the old shape of the moment close around him. The damage was on his car, the paint was beside her hand, the witness was calling from a window, and still Carol had managed to make his body the subject of suspicion. Price looked at Marcus for a moment longer than necessary. Not hostile, not warm, measuring. "Sir, I am going to need you to stay right there while I sort this out." Marcus nodded once. "I have no intention of going anywhere." Carol's breath softened, encouraged by the pause. "See? That tone. That is what I mean. He is always so cold." Marcus said nothing. He looked at the letters drying on the sedan door and tasted the sharp chemical smell in the air. The paint had run slightly near the bottom, forming thin black trails toward the chrome trim. His late wife had helped him choose that car after his appointment, teasing him that a federal judge should drive something dependable but not boring. The memory came and went like light through a closing door. Evan called down again. "Officer, I have the video. She was spraying the car before Mr. Ellison even came outside." Carol snapped her head toward him. "You are a child, Evan. You do not understand context." "Context does not change what the camera saw," Marcus said quietly. Price's eyes moved back to the spray can. "Mrs. Whitaker, did you touch that can?" Carol folded her arms across her cardigan. "I found it there." "On the curb?" "Near the car." "With fresh paint on the vehicle?" She hesitated, and in that small silence the whole street seemed to hear the first crack. Price crouched near the can without touching it, then looked toward Marcus's car, then toward the Miller porch camera blinking red above the doorway. "I am going to need everyone to stop talking for a minute," he said. But Carol could not stop. Control had become a habit too old to set down. "You do not know what it has been like since he moved here," she said louder now, turning again toward the neighbors. "This street used to feel safe." The sentence landed harder than she expected. Mrs. Bennett's face changed on her porch. Evan lowered his phone slightly, not out of doubt, but sadness. Marcus finally looked directly at Carol, and the streetlight caught the calm in his eyes. "My presence did not damage your safety, Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "Your prejudice damaged my car." Price looked up at that, and the neighborhood fell completely silent. The silence after Marcus spoke did not feel empty. It felt like every porch on Oak Ridge Lane had been asked a question and had no answer ready. Officer Price remained crouched near the spray can, his flashlight resting beside it on the pavement, the beam catching the wet black paint around the nozzle. Carol stood with her arms folded, her cardigan pulled tight around her shoulders, but the gesture no longer looked dignified. It looked defensive. Marcus stayed near the edge of his driveway, close enough to see the damage clearly, far enough not to crowd anyone into another excuse. The October air had sharpened, carrying the smell of paint, damp leaves, and cut grass from the lawns that everyone on the street worked so hard to keep perfect. The words on his sedan were beginning to dry. They had lost their shine at the edges, but not their meaning. Marcus looked at them without flinching. He had seen uglier words in case files, in anonymous letters, in comment sections people thought made them invisible, but there was something different about seeing hatred painted across something he touched every morning before work. It was not the car that hurt. It was the assumption behind the act, the belief that his presence needed correction, that his success could be questioned by damaging the surface of what he owned. He thought of his first week on the federal bench, when an attorney had mistaken him for court staff and asked where the judge was. He thought of the clerkship interview decades earlier when a partner complimented how articulate he was before asking a single legal question. He thought of Carol's careful phrases over the past 3 months, all those little concerns wrapped in neighborhood language. Now the wrapping had come off. Officer Price stood and turned toward him. "Mr. Ellison, do you want to make a statement?" Marcus looked from the officer to Evan's window, then to the porch camera blinking red above the Miller door. "Yes," he said. "But first, I want the scene documented correctly. Photograph the vehicle before anyone touches it. Preserve the spray can. Get the timestamp from that camera. Take the witness information from Evan Miller and Mrs. Bennett. And please make sure Mrs. Whitaker does not leave before you have finished speaking with her." Price blinked once, not offended, just surprised by the precision. "You seem familiar with procedure." Marcus's expression did not change. Enough to know that emotion should not replace evidence. Carol let out a small, brittle laugh. "Listen to him. He talks like he is in charge of everything." Marcus turned his eyes toward her, calm as still water. "No, Mrs. Whitaker. I am asking the process to be in charge." That quiet answer seemed to drain more color from her face than anger ever could have. Down the block, the man with the dog lowered his gaze. Mrs. Bennett leaned more heavily on her cane. Evan kept recording, but his phone had dipped slightly, as if he understood this was no longer just something to capture. It was something to remember. Marcus took one step closer to his car and stopped before the painted door. Under the streetlight, his reflection appeared broken by the black letters, his face divided across the glossy panel. For a moment, he said nothing at all. The night pressed around him, full of porch lights, open curtains, and people who had watched Carol's suspicion grow but had called it personality because it was easier. He placed his hands behind his back, breathing slowly, letting the cold air steady him. He did not need to shout. He did not need to tell them who he was yet. The truth was already present in the paint, the camera, the witness, the can on the curb, and the silence of a woman whose story was beginning to fail. Officer Price began with the car. He photographed the painted door from 3 angles, then took a closer picture of the spray can without touching it. His flashlight moved slowly, professionally, over the curb, the driveway, the dark stains on Carol's glove, and the wet mark on the edge of her cardigan where she had tried to wipe her fingers clean. Carol watched each small action with growing impatience, as if documentation itself were an insult. "Officer, this is being blown out of proportion," she said. "It is paint. I already told you I came over because I heard something." Price did not answer right away. He was looking at Evan Miller, who had come downstairs now in a hoodie and pajama pants, his phone held carefully in both hands. The boy's parents stood behind him on the porch, tense but silent. Evan swallowed, then tapped the screen. "It starts here," he said. The video played in the blue-white glow of the phone, and Oak Ridge Lane gathered around it without meaning to. There was Carol under the streetlight, walking quickly from her own driveway, looking over both shoulders, lifting the can, spraying the first long line across Marcus's sedan. There was no disturbance. No threat. No reason for her to be there except the one she had carried with her. Her face was visible when she turned toward the Miller house. Her hand was visible. The can was visible. Even her whispered words were faintly caught when the sound was raised. "This is what happens when people like you move in." The sentence returned to the street softer than before, but somehow heavier. Mrs. Bennett drew in a small breath. The man with the dog looked away. Carol's mouth opened, but the explanation that had seemed so easy minutes earlier had nowhere to stand. Officer Price looked at Marcus. "Sir, I need your full legal name and occupation for the report." Marcus reached into his back pocket and removed a slim leather case. He opened it with the same unhurried care he had shown all night and handed over his identification. Price read the card once. Then his posture changed. Not dramatically. Just enough that everyone close enough to see him understood the ground had shifted. His eyes moved from the card to Marcus's face, then back to the card again. "Your Honor," he said quietly. The two words traveled across the driveway like a sudden drop in temperature. Carol blinked. "What did you just call him?" Price straightened. "Honorable Marcus Ellison, United States District Judge." For the first time all night, Carol had no sound ready. Her face lost its practiced fear. The woman who had spoken so confidently about safety, standards, and people like him stood beside the curb with paint on her glove and a federal judge's damaged car in front of her. Marcus did not smile. He did not correct anyone. He simply took the identification back when Price returned it and placed it inside his pocket. "Officer," Marcus said, "I would like the video preserved, the cam collected properly, and the report to reflect the exact statement captured on the recording." Price nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Carol flinched at the title as though each use of it erased another piece of the story she had built. Evan looked from Marcus to Carol, his young face caught between shock and relief. Mrs. Bennet stepped off her porch and said, barely above a whisper, "I saw her near the car before you came out." That was all. One sentence. But it was the first honest thing the street had offered him all night. The quiet that followed was no longer uncertain. It had chosen a side. The second vehicle arrived without a siren, a dark federal sedan turning onto Oak Ridge Lane with a steadiness that made the neighborhood quiet all over again. Its headlights swept across the wet black letters on Marcus's car, across the spray can now marked with a small evidence cone, across Carol Whitaker's face as she stood beside the curb trying to understand how quickly the ground beneath her had disappeared. A woman stepped out from the passenger's side wearing a dark coat over a tailored suit, her hair pulled back, her expression calm and alert. Deputy United States Marshal Renee Hayes did not look impressed by the porches, the expensive lawns, or the cluster of neighbors gathered under warm lantern light. Her eyes went first to Marcus, then to Officer Price, then to the damaged vehicle. "Your Honor," she said with a short nod. Marcus returned it. "Deputy Hayes." Carol stared between them. The title had already shaken her, but the arrival of federal authority made it real in a way Officer Price's words had not. This was no longer a private embarrassment that could be softened by apologies or neighborhood gossip. It had become documented, witnessed, preserved. Deputy Hayes walked toward the car, keeping her hands clear of every surface. "Has anyone touched the vehicle since the officer arrived?" Price shook his head. "No. Photographs taken. Video identified. Witnesses present. Spray can not handled." Hayes nodded. "Good. Preserve the original doorbell footage, collect the can properly, photograph the gloves, and note the statement captured on audio." Carol found her voice then, thin and strained. "This is ridiculous. I did not know who he was." The sentence hung there, revealing more than she intended. Marcus looked at her, not with anger, but with a sadness so quiet it was almost harder to face. Deputy Hayes turned slowly. "Mrs. Whitaker, the seriousness of damaging property does not depend on whether you knew the owner's title." Carol's lips pressed together. "I was upset. I felt this neighborhood was changing." Mrs. Bennet looked down at her cane. Evan's father put a hand on his son's shoulder. The man with the dog stepped backward as if the sentence itself had made the streets smaller. Hayes did not soften. "That will be included in the report if you choose to make it part of your statement." Carol looked toward the neighbors, searching for the familiar comfort of people who had nodded along with her concerns in softer rooms, over coffee, behind curtains. None of them moved toward her now. Officer Price asked for her gloves. She removed them slowly, her hands trembling slightly from the cold and the collapse of her own certainty. The black smudge on the cardigan sleeve seemed darker under the flashlight. Evan sent the original video file to Officer Price while his mother watched, and Mrs. Bennet gave her statement in a low, careful voice, admitting she had seen Carol near the car before Marcus came outside. Each piece of truth arrived without drama. A timestamp. A witness. A stain. A voice on a recording. Carol's version of the night did not explode. It simply lost air. Marcus stood beside his driveway with his hands folded behind him, the streetlight drawing a silver line along his glasses. Deputy Hayes stepped closer to him and lowered her voice. "We will make sure this is handled through the proper channels." Marcus looked at the car, then at the porches filled with people who had watched his life on Oak Ridge Lane from a distance and mistaken their silence for innocence. "That is all I am asking," he said. Carol heard him and lowered her eyes. For the first time since he had moved in, she seemed to understand that the man she had tried to reduce to a warning on a car door had spent his life weighing truth for a living. And now, under the cold October light, truth was weighing her. By morning, Oak Ridge Lane looked almost unchanged, which somehow made the night before feel even heavier. The lawns were still clipped, the porch lanterns still polished, the maple leaves still scattered in copper and gold along the curb. But the silence was different now. It did not protect Carol Whitaker anymore. It exposed her. The federal sedan was gone, Officer Price's patrol car was gone, and the spray can had been taken away in an evidence bag. But the faint outline of black paint remained on Marcus Ellison's sedan where the tow service had not yet arrived to take it for cleaning. The words had been covered with a temporary sheet of brown paper taped carefully over the door, yet everyone on the block knew what was underneath. At 7:15, Carol stood behind the lace curtain in her front room, still wearing the same cardigan from the night before, her hair pinned too tightly, her face pale in the window glass. She had not slept. Twice she had opened her neighborhood chat group and found no new messages of support. Once, she had started typing an explanation about misunderstanding the situation, then deleted it when she realized misunderstanding did not explain the paint, the gloves, the video, or the sentence Evan's camera had captured. Across the street, Marcus stepped onto his porch in a charcoal suit, white shirt, and deep blue tie, carrying a leather briefcase in one hand and a travel mug in the other. He paused at the top step, breathing in the cold morning air. His face was calm, but the night had left a shadow beneath his eyes. Evan Miller came out from next door, backpack over one shoulder, moving slower than usual. "Mr. Ellison," he said. Marcus turned toward him. The boy swallowed. "I am sorry nobody said anything before." Marcus looked at the street, at the curtains that shifted and went still, at the houses that had watched suspicion grow because it had arrived dressed as concern. "You said something when it mattered," Marcus replied. Evan looked down, not fully comforted, but steadied. The tow truck rolled up a minute later, its amber lights flashing softly in the morning gray. The driver lowered the ramp with a mechanical hum that seemed too ordinary for what the car had carried through the night. Mrs. Bennet stood on her porch with both hands resting on her cane. She lifted one hand in a small wave. Marcus returned it. No speech. No performance. Just acknowledgement. As the sedan was pulled slowly onto the flatbed, the brown paper over the door loosened at one corner, revealing a thin smear of black paint beneath. Marcus watched it without anger. Then he felt someone looking at him, and turned. Carol stood in her doorway now, one hand on the frame, her mouth drawn tight around words she seemed unable to shape. For the first time since he had moved to Oak Ridge Lane, she did not look like a guardian of the street. She looked like a woman standing in the ruins of a story she had told herself for too long. Marcus did not cross the road. He did not demand an apology in front of the neighbors. He simply held her gaze for a moment and said, quietly enough that only Evan and Mrs. Bennet could hear, "Truth does not need to shout." Then his federal car arrived at the curb, dark and clean beneath the pale light. Marcus placed his briefcase inside, turned once toward the house where his late wife's lamp still glowed faintly through the study curtain, and got in. As the car moved down Oak Ridge Lane, curtains shifted again, but this time no one pretended not to be watching. Carol remained in her doorway, smaller against the white columns of the home she once believed gave her authority. The street stayed silent behind him, not peaceful yet, but awake. And in that silence, under the cold morning sky, the neighborhood finally understood that dignity can be damaged on the surface, but never owned by the hands that try to mark it.